Christmas used to feel warm when I was a child. But the Christmas I'm about to tell you about began with a silence so heavy it changed the way I understood my own family forever. The room was glowing with holiday lights. A 12-foot Christmas tree filled my mother's living room, decorated with gold ribbons and glass ornaments that reflected the warm yellow lamps on the walls. Underneath the tree was a mountain of presents wrapped in red and silver paper. 26 gifts. I remember the number clearly because I counted them while sitting on the carpet beside my daughter. Every single one had a tag. Every single one had a name. None of them belonged to her. My mother stood near the tree with her phone raised, recording everything, like it was some kind of perfect family commercial. My brother Brandon's kids tore through wrapping paper while everyone laughed and clapped. Another gift. Another cheer. Another bright smile. And beside me, my daughter sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap, waiting for her name to be called. It never was. When the last box was opened and the room exploded into applause, she tugged gently on my sleeve and whispered a question so soft no one else heard it. "Mom, did Grandma forget me?" That was the moment something inside me broke. And it was also the moment I realized this wasn't an accident. It was a choice. My name is Jennifer. I'm 34 years old, and I work as the head of marketing for a tech company in Seattle. My life is usually built around strategy, deadlines, and campaigns that launch on precise schedules, family gatherings. However, have never followed any kind of logic. For years, I avoided them whenever I could, not because I hated my family, but because I understood them. My mother, Danielle, had always been a woman who believed strongly in appearances. Holidays at her house were less about connection and more about creating a perfect picture of success. The decorations had to be flawless. The photos had to look happy. And the story of our family had always centered around one person, my older brother Brandon. Brandon was 37, a successful software engineer who lived only 20 minutes away from our mother's house. He had 2 children, a large house, and a lifestyle that fit perfectly into the narrative Danielle loved to present. The golden son, the successful family man. Everything in our family orbit seemed to revolve around him. My younger sister Kayla, who worked in human resources, had long ago learned the safest role was simply to stay agreeable. She laughed at Brandon's jokes, praised our mother's hosting skills, and rarely challenged anything that happened inside the family. And me, I was the inconvenient one, the daughter who moved away, the one who built a career in another city, the one who didn't show up to every holiday dinner and pretend everything was perfectly balanced. For several years, that distance had been intentional. But this Christmas, I had made a different decision. I had decided to come back. Not for Danielle. Not for Brandon. For my daughter. She was 7 years old. And this was the first year she had started asking real questions about family traditions. When she talked about Christmas at school, she heard other kids describe grandparents, cousins, big gatherings. So I thought maybe it was time. Maybe having a child in the room would soften things. Maybe seeing their granddaughter would change the way my family behaved. Maybe people grow. That hope lasted exactly 15 minutes after we walked through the front door. The house itself looked like something from a holiday catalog. The living room smelled of pine and cinnamon candles. Soft, instrumental Christmas music played from hidden speakers. Danielle hugged me quickly, already distracted by adjusting decorations on the mantel. "Jennifer, you made it?" she said with a polite smile. She bent slightly toward my daughter. "Oh, hello, sweetheart." The greeting lasted less than 3 seconds before she turned to greet Brandon's family arriving behind us. Brandon walked in carrying 2 large boxes of gifts while his kids ran straight toward the tree, already buzzing with excitement. "Mom, are we opening presents now?" one of them shouted. Danielle laughed warmly. Yes. Everyone sit down. Let's start." And that's exactly what they did. No one asked my daughter where she wanted to sit. No one asked if she was excited. She quietly sat next to me on the carpet while Brandon's children positioned themselves closest to the tree like they had done this every year. Danielle picked up the first gift. "All right," she said cheerfully. Let's begin. The first present went to Brandon's son. Then another. Then another. A remote control drone. A brand new gaming console. A custom Lego set still sealed in its collector's box. Every gift was met with laughter and applause. Danielle filmed the entire thing, narrating like a proud host, documenting the happiest family in the world. Look how excited they are, she said. Isn't this wonderful? Across the room, Kayla clapped and laughed along with the rest of them. No one seemed to notice the empty space next to me. At first, my daughter leaned forward slightly every time Danielle reached for another box. Her eyes moved quickly from tag to tag, reading the names. After a while, she stopped leaning forward. She just watched, quietly. And I began counting. 10 gifts, 14, 18, 23, 26. The final box was opened to cheers and wrapping paper flying across the floor. Danielle lowered her phone and smiled proudly at the scene she had captured. And that was when my daughter tugged gently on my sleeve. Her voice was barely louder than a breath. Mom? Did Grandma forget me? I looked around the room. Brandon shrugged like nothing unusual had happened. Kayla avoided my eyes. Danielle simply said, Oh, children forget things quickly. But I knew something they clearly didn't understand. Some moments don't disappear. Some moments stay with a child forever. And in that exact second, watching my daughter try to hold back tears in a room full of laughing relatives, I realized something very clearly. If I stayed there any longer, she would remember this night for the rest of her life. No one in the room seemed to notice the silence that followed my daughter's question. Mom, did Grandma forget me? The words were soft, almost swallowed by the music still playing quietly from the speakers. But to me, they sounded louder than anything else that had happened that evening. I felt her small hand tighten slightly around my sleeve. For a moment, I couldn't answer, because the truth was sitting right in front of us. 26 opened gifts scattered across the carpet. Not one of them hers. I looked up slowly. Brandon was busy helping his youngest child unwrap the packaging from a new tablet. Kayla was laughing at something on her phone while filming the kids showing off their presents. Danielle stood near the tree reviewing the video she had just recorded. No one looked over. No one even seemed aware that a child had just asked the quietest and saddest question in the room. I leaned closer to my daughter and brushed a strand of hair away from her face. No, I whispered gently. You didn't do anything wrong. Her eyes searched mine for a second, as if she was trying to understand something deeper than my words. Children can sense things adults pretend not to see. She nodded slowly but didn't speak again. Across the room, Danielle clapped her hands together. Well, she said brightly. Wasn't that wonderful? The room filled with cheerful agreement. Brandon grinned. Best Christmas yet, he said. Kayla laughed. Mom outdid herself this year. I stared at the pile of wrapping paper on the floor. 26 gifts. Brandon's kids were already comparing their presents excitedly. One was flying the drone around the living room while another tried to set up the new gaming console. The noise filled the house. But next to me, my daughter sat completely still. That contrast made something inside my chest tighten painfully. For a moment I considered speaking up. Just one sentence. Just asking the obvious question. Why? But I already knew how that conversation would end. Danielle would say it was an oversight. Brandon would shrug. Kayla would tell everyone not to ruin the holiday mood. And somehow the problem would quietly become my fault for bringing it up. I had seen that pattern too many times before. Instead, I stood up. The movement was so calm and ordinary that no one reacted immediately. I reached for my daughter's coat draped over the back of a chair. Sweetheart, I said softly. Go get your shoes. She looked at me, surprised. Are we leaving? Yes. The word was simple. Clear. Final. That was when Danielle finally noticed something was happening. Jennifer, she said, frowning slightly. Where are you going? I helped my daughter slide her arms into her coat. We're heading out. The room grew quieter. Brandon looked up from helping his son connect the console cables.
What?
Why? Kayla lowered her phone. Wait. What's going on? Danielle walked toward us with confusion turning quickly into irritation. You can't leave now, she said. We just opened presents. I zipped up my daughter's coat carefully. She didn't get any presents, I replied calmly. For a brief moment the room froze. Danielle blinked. Oh, she said dismissively. Well, children forget things quickly. I can always buy her something tomorrow. Something about the casual tone of that sentence made Brandon laugh lightly. Yeah, he added. It's not a big deal. Kayla shrugged. Jennifer, don't make it dramatic. It's Christmas. The words floated through the room like they were perfectly reasonable. But all I could hear was the quiet voice my daughter had used a minute earlier. Did Grandma forget me? I looked down at her. She wasn't crying. That somehow hurt even more. She was simply watching the floor, twisting the edge of her glove between her fingers. And suddenly I understood something very clearly. If I stayed, she would learn an important lesson tonight. Just not the one I wanted her to learn. Danielle crossed her arms now. You're overreacting, she said firmly. This is supposed to be a happy evening. Exactly, I said. That's why we're leaving. Brandon scoffed. You're really going to storm out over presents? I shook my head slightly. No. I took my daughter's hand. I'm leaving because my daughter deserves to feel welcome in her own family. The sentence hung in the air. Kayla shifted uncomfortably. Danielle's face hardened. You're ruining Christmas, she said sharply. But I didn't answer. Because sometimes arguments only trap you inside the very situation you're trying to escape. Instead, I walked toward the front door. Behind me, I could hear Brandon mutter something under his breath. Kayla whispered to Danielle. Someone laughed awkwardly, but none of them stopped me. The cold night air hit us as soon as I opened the door. Snow had started falling while we were inside. Small white flakes drifted quietly through the streetlights lining the quiet suburban road. My daughter squeezed my hand as we stepped onto the porch. Neither of us spoke. We walked to the car in silence. The house behind us still glowed with warm yellow light and distant laughter. When we sat inside the car, she looked at me again. Her voice was small but steady. Mom. Yes? Did I do something bad? My heart twisted. I reached over and brushed snow from her hair. No, I said softly. You did absolutely nothing wrong. She watched the falling snow through the windshield for a few seconds. Then she nodded. And we drove away from the house while Christmas music and laughter faded slowly behind us. The road out of my mother's neighborhood was quiet under the falling snow. Streetlights reflected off the thin white layer forming on the pavement, turning everything outside the windshield into a soft blur of gold and silver. Inside the car, the only sound was the low hum of the heater. My daughter sat in the passenger seat beside me, her small boots resting against the edge of the seat while she watched the snow drift past the window. She hadn't asked another question. She hadn't cried. That silence made the entire drive feel heavier. After a few minutes, she finally spoke again. Mom? Yes. Grandma really forgot. I kept my eyes on the road. For a second, I considered repeating the same comforting answer I had given earlier. But children can hear hesitation. They can tell when adults are trying to soften something that doesn't actually make sense. So instead I chose honesty, carefully shaped in a way she could understand. No, I said quietly. I don't think she forgot. She turned slightly toward me. Then why didn't she give me a present? That question had no easy answer. Because explaining favoritism to a 7-year-old meant explaining something about human nature most adults still struggled with. I slowed the car at a stoplight and looked at her. Sometimes, I said gently, adults make choices that aren't fair. She thought about that. Like when kids don't share toys? Something like that. The light turned green and we continued driving. Snow continued to fall steadily, covering the road behind us. I thought maybe, she said after a moment, if I was really quiet, she would remember. Her words felt like a small needle pressing directly into my chest. You were very patient. I told her. I saw that. She nodded slightly and looked back out the window. I tried to smile. I know. The rest of the drive passed quietly. When we reached our apartment building in Seattle, the snow had already begun to coat the sidewalks and parked cars. I helped her out of the car and we walked upstairs together. Inside, the apartment felt warm and peaceful. No cameras. No forced laughter. Just the quiet space we had built together over the past few years. She slipped off her boots and walked toward the small artificial Christmas tree standing in the corner of the living room. We had decorated it earlier that week with simple ornaments and handmade paper stars. Compared to Danielle's enormous tree, it looked tiny. But somehow it felt more real. "Can we still open the cookies we made?" she asked softly. "Of course." She smiled faintly. That small smile made something inside me loosen slightly. We warmed the cookies in the oven and sat on the couch together. For a while we watched the snow through the window while eating chocolate chip cookies and drinking hot cocoa. Eventually she leaned her head against my shoulder. "Mom!" "Yes." "Next year, can we have Christmas here again?" The question surprised me. "You didn't like Grandma's house?" She shook her head slightly. It was too loud. I smiled gently. "Then yes," I said. "We can stay here." She seemed satisfied with that answer. Within half an hour, she had fallen asleep on the couch, still holding the mug of cocoa in both hands. I carefully moved it aside and carried her to bed. After tucking the blanket around her shoulders, I stood quietly in the doorway for a moment watching her sleep. Children have a way of trusting the world again very quickly. But the adults around them decide what kind of world they grow up believing in. Back in the living room, I sat down and stared at the small Christmas tree. The quiet allowed memories to creep in. Because the truth was, tonight hadn't surprised me. Not completely. Danielle had always favored Brandon. When we were children, it showed up in small ways. Brandon got the newest computer first. Brandon's achievements were celebrated loudly at family dinners. Brandon's mistakes were always explained away as stress. When I moved away for college, Danielle had told people I was exploring independence. When Brandon moved away briefly for a job opportunity, she described it as a major career move. Same action, different narrative. Over the years, I learned something simple. In our family story, Brandon was always the main character. The rest of us played supporting roles. I had accepted that dynamic for a long time. Distance helped. But tonight had crossed a different line. Because favoritism among adults is one thing, but when it reaches the next generation, it becomes something else entirely. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the quiet apartment. The snow continued falling outside the window. For the first time that night, my phone buzzed. I looked down. A message from Kayla. It was short. "Mom says you're being dramatic." A second message arrived immediately after. "You should come back tomorrow." "She said she'll buy your daughter something." I read the words twice. Then I locked the phone and set it on the table. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. This wasn't about a present. It never had been. And somewhere deep in my memory, another thought surfaced. A memory of a conversation with my father years ago. A conversation about responsibility. About fairness. About something he had quietly put into place before he died. At the time, I hadn't understood why it mattered. But sitting there in the quiet glow of the small Christmas tree, I began to realize something unsettling. The story of tonight wasn't finished. Not even close. Because the people who had laughed in that living room had forgotten one very important detail about our family. Something my father had left behind. Something none of them had bothered to think about for years. And when the truth about it eventually surfaced, everything they believed about our family would begin to change. The next morning, the snow had stopped. Seattle looked quiet and pale under a soft layer of white. The streets still empty from the night before. The world always felt calmer after snowfall. As if the city itself had taken a deep breath. Inside the apartment, the only sound was the slow drip of coffee filling my mug. My daughter was still asleep. For a moment I stood by the window, watching a few early commuters brushing snow off their cars. The calm outside made it easier to think clearly about the night before. Because what had happened at Danielle's house wasn't new. It was just more obvious this time. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Another message from Kayla. "Mom says you embarrassed her." A few seconds later, another one appeared. You really shouldn't have left like that. I stared at the screen for a moment before setting the phone down again. The words didn't make me angry. They simply confirmed something I had understood for years. In our family, discomfort was always blamed on the person who pointed out the problem, never on the people who caused it. I took a sip of coffee and tried to focus on something else. But my mind kept drifting back to a memory that had surfaced the night before. A conversation with my father. He had passed away 5 years earlier after a brief illness that had come far too suddenly. In the weeks before he died, he had called each of us separately. Not dramatic conversations, just quiet ones, practical ones. When it had been my turn to visit him in the hospital, he had looked unusually serious. Jennifer, he said gently, families are complicated. I had smiled at the time. That's a polite way of putting it. He chuckled weakly. Yes, it is. Then he reached for a folder on the small table beside his bed. There are things I've arranged for the future, he said. Mostly financial protections. Nothing anyone needs to worry about right now. I remembered glancing at the papers without much interest. At the time, my focus had been on him getting better. What kind of protections? I asked. A trust, he explained. For the family assets. That wasn't surprising. My father had always been methodical about financial planning. But the next sentence had been strange. I included certain safeguards. What kind? He paused before answering. Safeguards to make sure fairness survives even when people forget about it. At the time, the phrase had sounded philosophical, almost sentimental. Dad, I said lightly, you're talking like you're planning a courtroom drama. He smiled faintly. Sometimes the future needs quiet preparation. I didn't ask more questions after that. And he never explained further. A sudden voice behind me pulled me out of the memory. Mom? I turned. My daughter stood in the hallway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Morning, I said. She walked into the kitchen slowly. Did it snow all night? Almost. She climbed onto one of the kitchen chairs and looked out the window. Everything looks different. Snow had that effect. It softened the edges of things. Are we still having Christmas here? She asked. Yes, I said. Her face brightened immediately. Can we decorate more? Of course. She smiled and ran to grab the small box of ornaments we had left on the shelf, while she hung paper stars and glitter-covered snowflakes onto the tiny tree. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Kayla. The number on the screen belonged to someone I hadn't heard from in years. Thomas Hale. The name immediately pulled another memory into focus. He had been my father's attorney. I hesitated before answering. Hello, Jennifer, the calm voice said. Good morning, Mr. Halle. Please call me Thomas. I sat down at the table. It's been a long time. Yes, he said. But something has come up that requires your attention. A small sense of unease crept into my chest. What kind of situation? It concerns the family trust your father established. I glanced toward the living room where my daughter was humming quietly while decorating the tree. What about it? Thomas paused for a moment. Recently, there was a request submitted regarding a financial withdrawal. From Brandon, I asked automatically. Yes. That answer didn't surprise me. What kind of withdrawal? A fairly large investment request. I leaned back in the chair. And that involves me how... Another short pause. Then Thomas spoke carefully. Because certain conditions in the trust have been triggered. The sentence instantly sharpened my attention. What conditions? Administrative review. And under those circumstances, he continued, the trust requires consultation with the successor trustee. The phrase sounded vaguely familiar. I frowned. Who is that? Thomas's voice remained calm. You are... For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. Sorry, what? You were designated as the successor trustee in the original documents. I stared at the wall for several seconds. I don't remember agreeing to that. You didn't need to, he said. Your father made the appointment. The words settled slowly in my mind. So what does that actually mean? It means, Thomas said, That if certain financial decisions require oversight, the authority temporarily shifts to you. I looked toward the small Christmas tree again. My daughter had just placed the final ornament and stepped back proudly to admire it. A quiet thought formed in the back of my mind, one that connected last night. My father's strange conversation. And the phone call happening now. What kind of oversight? I asked slowly. Thomas answered calmly. The kind that can determine the financial future of the entire family. I held the phone in my hand for several seconds after Thomas finished speaking. The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet. Across the room, my daughter was adjusting the last ornament on our small Christmas tree, humming softly to herself like the entire world was perfectly simple. Meanwhile, I was trying to process the sentence I had just heard. The authority temporarily shifts to you, Jennifer, Thomas said gently through the phone. Yes, I replied, pulling myself back into the conversation. Are you still there? I am. Good, he said. I realize this might sound sudden, but the trust documents are very clear. I leaned back in the chair. So let me make sure I understand this. Of course. My brother requested money from the family trust. That's correct. And because of that request, some kind of review process was triggered. Yes. And now you're telling me that review involves me. Yes. The word hung in the air. My father's calm voice from years ago echoed faintly in my memory. Safeguards to make sure fairness survives. I exhaled slowly. How much money are we talking about? Thomas didn't hesitate. $700,000. The number landed like a stone in my chest. That's not exactly a small investment. No, he said. It isn't. What does Brandon want it for? According to the request documents, he intends to invest in a new technology startup with several colleagues. That sounds like him, I said quietly. My brother had always loved the idea of big opportunities, high-risk ventures, the promise of rapid success. But there was something about this situation that made me uneasy. Does Danielle know about this? I asked. Yes, and she approved it. She supported the request. That didn't surprise me at all. In our family, Brandon's ideas were rarely questioned. What exactly am I supposed to do? I asked. Thomas answered calmly. The trust agreement requires that any withdrawal above a certain amount be reviewed by the successor trustee when the acting trustee has a personal connection to the request. I frowned. So because Mom is Brandon's mother, her decision could be considered a conflict of interest. That explanation made perfect sense, which probably explained why my father had written the clause in the first place. Your role, Thomas continued, is simply to review the situation and determine whether the request meets the financial protections established in the trust. And if it doesn't, then the withdrawal cannot proceed. I stared at the coffee mug in front of me. The steam had stopped rising. What happens if I say no? Then the funds remain in the trust. And Brandon? He would need to secure investment elsewhere. Silence filled the line for a few seconds. Finally, I asked the question that had been forming in the back of my mind. Does Brandon know about this clause? Thomas chuckled softly. I suspect he hasn't read the full document. That didn't surprise me either. Brandon had never been the type to read legal paperwork carefully. He preferred shortcuts, confidence, momentum. Meanwhile, my father had been the opposite. Methodical, quietly thorough. Jennifer, Thomas said carefully, I should also mention something important. What's that? This review process hasn't officially begun yet. Why not? Because we first needed to confirm that you were willing to participate. I looked toward the living room again. My daughter had now curled up on the couch beneath the small Christmas tree, watching snow fall outside the window. $700,000. The number echoed again in my mind. That kind of money could change someone's future. Or destroy it. I'll review the documents, I said finally. Good. I want to understand everything before making any decision. That's exactly what your father expected you to do. Something about that sentence made me pause. Expected. Yes. Thomas's voice softened slightly. Your father chose you for this role very deliberately. Why? Because he believed you were the only person in the family who would treat the responsibility seriously. The words sat heavily in my chest. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I'll send the full trust documents to your email. Thomas continued. Take your time reviewing them. Thank you. We ended the call shortly after that. For a few minutes, I simply sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing. Then I opened my laptop. The email arrived almost immediately. Subject line: Family Trust Review Documents. I clicked it open. The attachment contained dozens of pages of legal language. My father's signature appeared near the beginning. The date was 5 years old. I began reading slowly. Most of the document described standard trust structures, asset management, distribution rules, long-term financial protections. Then I found the clause Thomas had mentioned. Section 14. Conflict of Interest Review. The wording was precise. If the acting trustee approved a financial withdrawal that directly benefited an immediate family member, the decision required review by the successor trustee. And if the successor trustee determined the withdrawal created unacceptable risk, the request could be denied. I leaned back in my chair again. The legal structure was clear, thoughtful, intentional. My father had anticipated something like this years ago. A sudden noise pulled my attention back to the living room. My daughter had knocked over one of the ornaments and was trying to catch it before it rolled under the couch. Got it, she said proudly. I smiled. Then I looked back at the laptop screen, because another thought had just occurred to me. Brandon didn't know any of this yet. Neither did Danielle. They still believed the trust worked the same way it always had, which meant something very interesting was about to happen. Sooner or later, they were going to find out that the person they had dismissed the night before was now the one reviewing a $700,000 decision. The documents took most of the afternoon to read. Legal language has a strange rhythm. Long sentences, careful wording, clauses nested inside other clauses. Normally I would skim something like that quickly, but this time I forced myself to read every line. Because the more I understood the trust, the more I realized something important. My father hadn't created it casually. He had designed it carefully. The structure covered almost everything: asset protection, tax management, long-term family stability. There were provisions for property, investment funds, and several accounts I hadn't even known existed. But the clause Thomas mentioned appeared again and again in different sections. Conflict review, financial oversight, successor trustee authority. My name appeared in those sections multiple times. I leaned back in the chair and closed the laptop slowly. 5 years. For 5 years, this structure had existed quietly in the background of our family's life, and none of us had talked about it. Or maybe none of them had bothered to ask. My phone buzzed again on the kitchen table. Brandon. The name appeared across the screen like a flashing warning. I let it ring for a moment before answering. Hey, he said immediately. His tone sounded casual, but something underneath it felt tight. Hi. You left pretty fast last night. Yes. There was a short pause. Mom's pretty upset, he added. I'm sure she is. You didn't have to make it a whole thing, he continued. Kids forget stuff like that. I didn't respond. Sometimes silence says more than argument. Brandon exhaled impatiently. Look, Mom said she'll send a gift this week. It's not worth dragging this out. That's not the issue. Then what is... For a moment I thought about explaining everything. The documents, the phone call, the trust review, but something stopped me. Instead I asked a simple question. Did you request money from the family trust recently? The line went quiet. Not the casual quiet of someone thinking, the careful quiet of someone recalculating. Where did you hear that? He asked. So you did. That's none of your business. His reaction confirmed everything. It actually might be, I said calmly. Brandon let out a short laugh. Jennifer. Come on. Mom handles the trust. Usually. What does that mean? I leaned back in my chair again. I spoke with Thomas Hale today. Another silence. This one longer? You called Dad's lawyer, Brandon said slowly. No. He called me. Why? Because your request triggered a review clause. I could almost hear Brandon's confusion through the phone. What clause? Conflict review. That doesn't make any sense. It does if you read the trust documents. He scoffed. Mom approved the withdrawal. I know. So there's no issue. That depends. On what? On the successor trustee. Brandon laughed again. But this time it sounded forced. Okay. I have no idea what you're talking about. That's not surprising. What's that supposed to mean? It means you probably didn't read the paperwork. His patience was starting to disappear. Jennifer. Stop talking in riddles. I took a slow breath. Dad named a successor trustee in case of conflicts. So that person reviews large withdrawals. And that person is me. The silence that followed stretched for several seconds. Then Brandon spoke again. That's not possible. It is. Mom would have told me. Maybe she didn't know. That's ridiculous. You should probably check the documents. His voice sharpened. You're seriously saying you can block the investment? I'm saying I review it, which means you can stop it. That depends on the financial risk. Another long pause. When Brandon spoke again, the tone had changed. The confidence was gone. You're not going to do something stupid. Are you? What do you mean by stupid? Like holding this up because you're still mad about Christmas. The accusation sat heavily between us. I looked toward the living room where my daughter was drawing pictures at the coffee table. No, I said quietly. This has nothing to do with Christmas. Good. But it does have something to do with responsibility. Brandon sighed loudly. This investment is solid. That's what every investment pitch says. You don't understand the tech industry. I understand financial risk. You're a marketing manager, Jennifer, and you're asking for $700,000. The sentence ended the argument for a moment. Finally, Brandon spoke again. You're really going to review this like some kind of judge? That's what the trust requires. This is unbelievable. I'm sure it feels that way. His voice dropped slightly. Mom isn't going to like this. That's not my concern. You're turning this into a power play. No, I replied calmly. I'm doing exactly what Dad asked. Brandon muttered something under his breath. Then he said, We'll talk about this soon. The call ended abruptly. I stared at the dark phone screen for a moment. Then I set it down on the table. Because one thing had become very clear. The quiet balance in our family had just shifted. And for the first time in years, Brandon had realized something uncomfortable. He wasn't the one controlling the situation anymore. 2 days later, the email from Thomas arrived with the complete financial packet attached. It contained everything Brandon had submitted with his request. Business projections, investment summaries, startup valuation estimates, dozens of pages outlining the opportunity he was chasing. I opened the files at the kitchen table while my daughter worked on a puzzle nearby. The company Brandon wanted to invest in was called Orion Circuit, a small artificial intelligence startup based in California. According to the documents, the founders claimed they were building a next-generation cloud infrastructure system designed to optimize AI processing speeds. The pitch was ambitious. Too ambitious. I had spent enough years in the tech industry to recognize a familiar pattern. Every startup presentation promised revolutionary technology, exponential growth, and future dominance. Most of them never came close. The numbers in the projection chart immediately caught my attention. They were aggressive, extremely aggressive. According to their plan, Orion Circuit expected to multiply its valuation by 20 within 4 years. That kind of prediction didn't automatically mean fraud, but it almost always meant risk. I continued reading. The funding round Brandon wanted to join would raise $12 million from several private investors. His share would be $700,000. A large personal stake, but not large enough to control anything, which meant he would simply be one investor among many, depending entirely on the founder's decisions. I leaned back in the chair. Mom, my daughter asked from the floor. Yes. Why do you look like that? Like what? Like when you read boring emails. I smiled slightly. That's because I'm reading something complicated. She nodded seriously and returned to her puzzle. For the next hour, I continued reviewing the documents carefully. The more I read, the more certain I became of one thing. Brandon had fallen in love with the idea of the investment, not the reality of it. Eventually, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Kayla. I answered. "Hey," she said cautiously. "Hi." I talked to Brandon. "I figured." She sighed. "He says you're blocking his investment." "I'm reviewing it." "Same difference." "That depends on the numbers." Kayla hesitated for a moment. "You know, Mom is furious." "That doesn't surprise me. She thinks you're doing this because of Christmas." "That's not the reason." "Then what is—" "The trust rules." Kayla let out a small laugh. "You always did take Dad's stuff seriously. Someone had to—" Her voice softened slightly. "Jennifer, this is Brandon's chance to do something big. Or something reckless. He believes in it. That's not the same thing as due diligence." Kayla was quiet for a moment. "You're really going to hold him to financial standards?" "Yes. That's going to cause a huge fight." "I know." Another pause followed. Then Kayla asked quietly, "Did Dad really put you in charge?" "Yes." "Why?" I thought about that question for a moment. "I think he trusted me to read the fine print." Kayla didn't answer. Eventually she said, "Mom wants everyone to come over this weekend." "For what?" "To talk." I almost laughed. "That sounds productive." "You should come." "Why?" "Because Brandon isn't backing down." I closed the laptop slowly. "That's his choice." "And what about you?" "I'm not backing down either." Kayla sighed again. "Family meetings always end badly." "That's true." "But sometimes they reveal the truth." "What truth?" "That not everyone in the room is playing by the same rules." The line went quiet again. Then Kayla said softly, "You've changed." "Jennifer, maybe before. You would have just ignored something like this." "Before." My daughter wasn't watching. Kayla didn't respond. Eventually, she said goodbye and hung up. I looked down at the laptop screen again. The Orion circuit proposal was still open. The numbers hadn't changed. The risk hadn't changed. But something else had. The emotional pressure surrounding the decision. I reopened the trust documents and reread the clause about financial oversight. The language was unmistakable. The successor trustee had the responsibility to protect the long-term stability of the trust, not individual family ambitions, not personal enthusiasm. Stability. That was the key word. My father had always believed that financial decisions should survive careful analysis. If something couldn't survive scrutiny, it probably shouldn't survive investment either. I began making notes on the document. Revenue projections, burn rate estimates, founder background checks, market competition. Each point raised more questions. Questions Brandon clearly hadn't asked. After another hour of reviewing the material, I closed the laptop again. The decision wasn't final yet, but my instincts were becoming clearer. Because the more I studied the investment, the more obvious something became. Brandon wasn't asking the trust for support. He was asking it to absorb his risk. And those two things were very different. Across the room, my daughter finished her puzzle and looked up proudly. "Done." I walked over and looked at the completed picture. "Nice work." She smiled. "Can we go outside and build a snowman?" "Sure." As we put on our coats and headed outside into the cold afternoon air, a strange thought crossed my mind. Brandon believed this situation was about money. Danielle believed it was about family authority. Kayla believed it was about avoiding conflict. But in reality, something much bigger was happening. For the first time in our family, someone had to decide whether fairness actually mattered. And the person making that decision was me. Saturday afternoon arrived faster than I expected. The sky over Seattle was pale and cold, the kind of winter light that makes the entire city look quieter than usual. I parked my car in front of Danielle's house and sat there for a moment with the engine off. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. Perfect lawn, perfect windows, perfect decorations. From the outside, nothing about this place had ever suggested conflict. Inside, I knew things would be different. Are we visiting Grandma? My daughter asked from the back seat. Yes, I said. She seemed thoughtful. Is she still mad? I turned slightly toward her. I don't know. Are you? The question caught me off guard. No, I said honestly. I'm just here to talk. She nodded slowly. Okay. We walked up the front steps together. The door opened before I could knock. Danielle stood there waiting. Her expression was polite, but the warmth she normally performed for visitors was noticeably missing. Jennifer, she said. Mom? She glanced down at my daughter. Hello. My daughter waved shyly. Hi, Grandma. Danielle stepped aside so we could enter. The living room still looked almost identical to the way it had on Christmas night. The tree was still standing. Though many of the presents were gone now, Brandon sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone. Kayla stood near the window holding a cup of coffee. Everyone was already waiting. That told me this wasn't just a casual family visit. It was a meeting. Brandon looked up first. Well, he said. The trustee has arrived? The sarcasm in his voice filled the room immediately. I ignored it. Hi, Brandon. Kayla offered a small nod. Hey. Danielle closed the door behind us. Your daughter can watch television in the den, she said, gesturing toward the hallway. My daughter looked at me. It's okay, I told her. I'll come get you soon. She walked quietly down the hallway. As soon as she disappeared from view, the atmosphere in the room changed. Danielle turned to face me fully. Let's get something straight, she said immediately. This whole situation has gotten completely out of control. I took off my coat calmly. What situation? You know exactly what situation, she replied sharply. Your brother told us about your phone call with Thomas. Brandon leaned forward. You're holding up my investment. I'm reviewing it. That's not your job. Actually, it is. Danielle crossed her arms. You're not the trustee. I'm the successor trustee. That's a technicality. It's a legal responsibility. Brandon laughed bitterly. Dad never meant for you to interfere with family decisions. He wrote the clause, because lawyers always write complicated stuff. That doesn't make it optional. Danielle stepped closer now. You're humiliating your own family. I'm following the trust agreement. That money belongs to all of us. It belongs to the trust. Brandon stood up from the couch. This is ridiculous, he said. You're acting like some kind of financial inspector. I'm acting like someone who read the documents. Kayla finally spoke. Can we all just slow down for a second? Her voice wasn't angry. Just tired. We're still a family, she added. That hasn't changed. Brandon shook his head. No. What's changed is Jennifer suddenly thinks she runs everything. I met his eyes calmly. I review one decision. That decision affects my future. It also affects the trust. Danielle scoffed. You're exaggerating the risk. Have you read the investment proposal? Brandon waved his hand dismissively. It's a great opportunity. That's not analysis. It's a growing AI company. It's an early-stage startup. It's the future of technology. It's a high-burn-rate venture with uncertain revenue. Brandon stared at me like he had never heard those words before. You've been digging through the documents. Yes. That's not necessary. It's exactly what Dad intended. Danielle shook her head in disbelief. I can't believe you're doing this. Doing what? Trying to control the family. I'm protecting the trust. That's the same thing. No, I said quietly. It isn't. The room fell silent. Brandon paced across the carpet. This is about Christmas, he said suddenly. You're still angry. I thought about that accusation. Then I shook my head. If this were about Christmas, I wouldn't be sitting here calmly discussing financial risk. You're punishing us. I'm doing due diligence. You always have to make things complicated. Financial decisions are complicated. Kayla rubbed her forehead. This is going nowhere. Brandon turned toward Danielle. Tell her to approve it. Danielle looked at me again. You need to stop this review process, she said firmly. No. Her eyes narrowed. You don't have the authority to challenge me. Yes, I do. Not in this house. This isn't about your house. It's about respect. It's about the trust. Brandon threw his hands in the air. Fine, he said. What exactly do you want? I pulled a folder from my bag and placed it on the coffee table. Answers. He frowned. What kind of answers? Financial projections. Founder accountability. Risk mitigation. And one very simple question. Brandon looked irritated. What question? I opened the folder slowly. Why? I asked calmly. Does this startup expect to burn $9 million before reaching profitability? Brandon stared at the folder on the coffee table like it contained a language he didn't speak. What are you talking about? He asked. The burn rate, I said calmly. He frowned. You're going to have to translate that into normal English. I slid the first page of the report toward him. It means the company expects to spend $9 million before it becomes profitable. So that means the investors are responsible for funding those losses. That's how startups work. Yes, I said. But not all startups burn that much capital before producing revenue. Brandon flipped through the page without really reading it. You're nitpicking? I'm analyzing? It's still a good opportunity. According to who? The founders. That's not objective. Danielle stepped forward again. You're acting like some kind of corporate auditor. That's essentially what this review requires. You're humiliating Brandon in his own family. I'm asking questions. Questions that don't matter. They matter to the trust. Brandon tossed the page back onto the table. You're trying to make this sound risky. It is risky. That's the entire point of investing. Yes, I said. But responsible investing requires understanding the downside. There is no downside. I looked directly at him. That sentence alone makes me nervous. Kayla let out a quiet breath from the corner of the room. Can we slow down for a second? Brandon ignored her. You don't understand the market, he said to me. I understand financial exposure. You work in marketing. I work in technology companies. That's not venture capital. No, I said. But basic math applies everywhere. I opened another page from the folder. According to their projections, they won't generate real revenue until year 4. That's normal. Not when the valuation is already inflated. Brandon crossed his arms. You're reading this wrong. Then explain it. I don't need to explain it. Yes. You do. Why? Because you're asking the trust to absorb the risk. Danielle shook her head. You're twisting everything. No. Yes? She insisted. You're trying to justify blocking Brandon's opportunity. I'm trying to understand it. There's nothing to understand. There's always something to understand. Brandon leaned forward. You want honesty? Yes. Fine. He pointed at the documents. I believe in the founders. That's not analysis. It's instinct. Instinct doesn't protect $700,000. Kayla finally walked over to the coffee table. Let me see the numbers, she said. She flipped through the pages slowly. Her expression shifted as she read. Wait, she said quietly. What? The operational expenses here are huge. Brandon frowned. It's a tech startup. Still, Kayla said. This growth curve is optimistic. Danielle looked irritated. Kayla, you're not helping. I'm just reading the report. Brandon shook his head. You're all acting like this is some kind of scam. I didn't say that, I replied. Then what are you saying? I'm saying the trust needs stronger guarantees before committing this kind of money. What kind of guarantees? Equity protections. Board oversight. Founder liability clauses. Brandon blinked. You want to rewrite the investment deal? No, I want the trust protected. Danielle's patience finally snapped. This is absurd, she said sharply. You're treating your own brother like a stranger asking for a bank loan. That's essentially what this is. He's family. Exactly. That means we trust him. It means we protect him from catastrophic mistakes. Brandon scoffed. You really think I'm making a catastrophic mistake? I think you're emotionally attached to the opportunity. That's insulting. It's human. Kayla looked between us. I hate to say it, she said slowly, but Jennifer might have a point. Brandon turned toward her. You're siding with her now. I'm siding with the numbers. Danielle looked furious. This family used to support each other. It still can, I said. Then approve the investment. Not without conditions. What conditions? I closed the folder and looked directly at Brandon. Financial transparency from the founders. Monthly performance reports. And a cap on the trust's exposure. Brandon stared at me. That's ridiculous. That's responsible. You're turning this into a negotiation. It already is. Danielle's voice dropped to a cold whisper. You're enjoying this. No. You always resented Brandon. That's not true. You're finally getting revenge. The accusation hung in the air. For a moment no one spoke. Then I said quietly, if I wanted revenge, I could simply deny the request. Brandon froze. What? The trust allows that. Danielle's expression changed slightly. You're bluffing. No. Kayla looked back down at the documents. Actually, she might not be. The room suddenly felt smaller. Because in that moment, everyone in the room finally understood something they hadn't realized before. The decision didn't belong to Brandon. It didn't belong to Danielle. And for the first time in our family's history, the person holding that decision wasn't the one they had always expected. No one spoke for several seconds after Kayla said it. Actually, she might not be. The silence in the living room felt heavier than anything that had happened earlier in the conversation. Brandon stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Danielle's expression hardened slowly, like someone trying to maintain control of a situation that was slipping away. Finally, Brandon broke the silence. You're not serious, he said. I am. You would actually block this investment. I would block it if it threatens the stability of the trust. That's insane. That's the responsibility Dad created. Brandon shook his head. You're hiding behind paperwork. I'm following the rules he wrote. He never intended for you to use it against your own family. I looked at him calmly. I'm not using it against you. Then approve the money. Not without safeguards. Danielle stepped forward again. You're dragging this out for no reason. There is a reason. What? The numbers. Brandon threw his hands in the air. You keep talking about numbers like they're everything. In financial decisions. They usually are. This is an opportunity. It's also a risk. All investments are risks. Yes. But some are irresponsible. His jaw tightened. You think I'm irresponsible? I think you're excited. That's not the same thing. No, I said quietly. It isn't. Kayla flipped through the documents again. There's another thing, she said. What? Brandon asked. This valuation jump in year 3. What about it? It assumes they dominate the market almost immediately. That's the plan. It's also extremely optimistic. Brandon looked frustrated. You two are reading this like pessimists. We're reading it like analysts. Danielle suddenly laughed coldly. This is unbelievable. What is... You sitting here pretending you're some kind of financial authority? I'm the successor trustee. That's a technical label. It's a legal role. You've changed. Maybe I've just started paying attention. Brandon leaned forward again. Let's be honest, he said. You're enjoying this? No. You finally have power over the rest of us. That's not what this is. Then what is it? I paused before answering. Responsibility. Danielle scoffed. Don't pretend this isn't about Christmas. The word hung in the air. Brandon nodded slightly. You walked out that night, he said. You were embarrassed. No. Yes. Danielle insisted. You were angry. I looked at her calmly. I was protecting my daughter. That's dramatic. She was the only child without a gift. That was an oversight. No, I said quietly. It wasn't. Brandon shifted uncomfortably. That has nothing to do with this investment. It has something to do with fairness. This is business. And fairness still matters. Danielle shook her head. You're mixing emotions with finances. No, I replied. I'm separating them. Brandon frowned. What does that mean? It means the decision I make won't be emotional. Good. It will be based on facts. Then approve the investment. Not yet. Brandon slammed his hand lightly on the coffee table. This is ridiculous. What part? You're stalling. I'm reviewing. You've had enough time. I'll decide when the review is complete. Danielle's voice dropped lower. You don't understand the consequences of this. What consequences? Family consequences. I'm aware. You're creating conflict. No, I said. I'm revealing it. The sentence lingered in the room. Kayla quietly closed the folder of documents. I think Dad knew something, she said softly. Everyone turned toward her. What do you mean? Brandon asked. She looked between us. I think he knew someday we'd end up arguing about money. Danielle frowned. Your father trusted this family. He also built safeguards, Kayla replied. That suggests he had doubts. Brandon ran a hand through his hair. This is insane. No, Kayla said quietly. It's complicated. The room fell silent again. Finally, Brandon looked back at me. So what happens now? I finish the review. And then I make a decision. Danielle crossed her arms. And if that decision isn't what we want, I met her eyes. Then the trust protects itself. Brandon let out a frustrated breath. You really think Dad wanted you to control the family? No. What then? I think he wanted someone to protect it. Danielle shook her head again. You're overestimating your role. Maybe. But the documents are clear. Kayla looked down at the folder once more. I read the clause, she said quietly. Brandon turned toward her. And Jennifer's right. Danielle stared at her in disbelief. Kayla, the successor trustee has the final review authority. Brandon sat back slowly. For the first time since the conversation started, he looked uncertain. The balance in the room had shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. Because something had finally become obvious to everyone present. The argument was no longer about opinions. It was about authority. And the authority didn't belong to the people who had always assumed it would. For a few seconds after Kayla said it, no one in the room moved. The quiet felt almost unnatural, like the air itself had thickened around us. Brandon was the first to react. That's not possible, he said again, though his voice no longer carried the same certainty. Kayla didn't look up from the documents. It's written right here, she said quietly. Danielle's expression hardened further. Give me that. Kayla handed her the papers. Danielle scanned the paragraph quickly, her eyes moving across the lines like she was searching for something that would prove the entire situation wrong. Her jaw tightened. This doesn't change anything, she said. It changes a lot, I replied calmly. You're misinterpreting the language. No, you don't even understand trust law. That's why Thomas Hale exists. Brandon leaned forward again. You actually talked to him about this? Yes. And he told you that you can override Mom. I can review the decision. That's not the same thing. It is if the decision fails the financial protection requirements. Danielle lowered the papers slowly. You're turning a family discussion into a legal process. It already is one. Your father never intended for lawyers to get involved in family matters. He literally hired a lawyer to design the system. Brandon rubbed his temples. This is unbelievable. What part? The part where my own sister is threatening to block my investment. I'm not threatening anything. You're holding all the cards. No, I said quietly. The trust holds the cards. Kayla looked between us again. What exactly happens if Jennifer denies the request? She asked. Danielle spoke immediately. That won't happen. But hypothetically, Kayla insisted. I answered before Danielle could interrupt again. The withdrawal doesn't happen. Brandon stared at me. That's it. That's it. And the money stays locked in the trust. Yes. For how long? Until a different proposal passes review. Brandon leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling. This is insane. Danielle walked toward me again, her voice tight with frustration. You're humiliating your own family. No. Yes? She said sharply. You are. I'm asking questions. You're questioning your brother's judgment. Because the trust requires it. You're acting like a stranger. I'm acting like the successor trustee. Brandon suddenly laughed, but the sound carried no humor. You know what's really funny? He said. What? You've been waiting for something like this. That's not true. You always thought I got everything. I never said that. You didn't have to. Danielle nodded in agreement. Your resentment has been obvious for years. I looked at both of them calmly. This has nothing to do with resentment. Yes, it does. No, I said quietly. It has to do with responsibility. Brandon shook his head. Stop hiding behind that word. It's not hiding. You're enjoying controlling the situation. If I wanted control, I replied calmly, I would have already denied the request. The room went silent again. Danielle frowned. You could actually do that? Yes. Kayla looked surprised. Immediately. Yes. Brandon sat forward slowly. You're serious? I am. Danielle looked angry now. You wouldn't dare. I would if the numbers justified it. That money belongs to this family. That money belongs to the trust. And the trust belongs to the family. It belongs to the future of the family. Brandon stared at me carefully now. So what exactly do you want? Transparency? You already have the documents. I want answers. To what? To the risk. You're exaggerating the risk. Then explain the financial model. He didn't answer. Danielle stepped in again. You're putting your brother on trial. I'm reviewing his request. You're making him defend himself. That's what happens when someone asks for $700,000. Brandon exhaled slowly. You really think this investment is that dangerous? I think it's incomplete. Incomplete how? Your founders haven't proven revenue. That's normal. They haven't proven scalability. That's early stage. They haven't proven market adoption. That comes later. I folded my hands together. Exactly. He frowned. What does that mean? It means the trust would be financing uncertainty. That's what investors do. Professional investors. I said. Negotiate protection clauses. Brandon looked confused. What kind of clauses? Board access. Financial reporting. Investor protections. Danielle scoffed again. You're turning this into corporate bureaucracy. I'm turning it into responsible investment. Brandon looked down at the documents again. For the first time since the conversation started, he seemed to be reading them carefully. Kayla watched him quietly. What if she's right? She asked softly. Danielle snapped her head toward her. Kayla, what if the risk really is higher than we thought? Brandon said nothing. He kept reading. Finally, he looked back up at me. So you're saying you might approve the investment if the deal changes? Yes. Danielle shook her head in disbelief. You're negotiating now. I'm protecting the trust. Brandon leaned back slowly. You really meant what you said earlier. What? That you're not doing this out of revenge. I held his gaze. No. The room grew quiet again. And in that quiet moment, something subtle shifted. For the first time since the conversation started, Brandon stopped arguing. Because he had finally begun to realize something uncomfortable. The decision wasn't emotional. It was structural. And for once in our family, the structure didn't favor him. I left my mother's house that evening without raising my voice. The conversation had ended quietly, almost strangely calm after everything that had been said. Brandon remained on the couch reading the documents again. Kayla stood by the window staring at the street outside. Danielle said nothing as I put my coat back on. No one tried to stop me this time. Outside, the cold air felt sharp and clean. The sky had darkened into that deep blue winter color that appears just before night settles in. I walked slowly toward the car, feeling the strange weight of the afternoon beginning to fade. My daughter was already waiting inside, watching something quietly on the tablet I had given her earlier. When I opened the door, she looked up. Are we going home? Yes. She smiled. Good. The word carried no resentment, no disappointment, no lingering sadness from Christmas night. Children move forward much faster than adults. As I started the engine, She looked out the window toward the house. Did you finish talking? I did. Was Grandma mad? I thought about the question for a moment. Maybe a little. She nodded thoughtfully. That happens sometimes. Yes, I said softly. It does. The drive back to Seattle was quiet and peaceful. The roads were mostly empty, and the soft glow of streetlights reflected off the snow that still covered the sidewalks. For the first time in days, my mind felt clear, because the truth was something simple. The meeting hadn't solved everything. Brandon still wanted the investment. Danielle still believed I had overstepped. Kayla was still caught somewhere in the middle. But something had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. When I arrived home, my daughter ran inside ahead of me and immediately sat beneath our small Christmas tree again. The decorations were still there. Paper stars, silver ribbon, one crooked ornament she had insisted on placing at the very top. She looked up at me from the floor. Mom. Yes. Next Christmas, can we still stay home? I smiled. Yes. Even if Grandma invites us. Yes. She seemed satisfied with that answer. Then she returned to coloring quietly while I sat down on the couch and checked my phone. A new email had arrived from Thomas. Subject: Trust review decision. I opened it slowly. The message was short. Jennifer, whenever you are ready, the Trust Administration Office will proceed according to your final recommendation. Please confirm your decision. I stared at the message for a moment, because the decision itself had become very clear over the past 2 days. I opened a new reply. Then I typed carefully. Approve conditional investment review. Funds may proceed only if the founders agree to financial reporting requirements and risk protection clauses. Otherwise, the request is denied. I read the message once more. Then I pressed send. The email disappeared from the screen. And just like that, the responsibility my father had quietly passed to me years earlier had finally been used. Not to punish anyone. Not to win an argument. Just to protect something that mattered. A few minutes later, my daughter climbed onto the couch beside me. Mom. Yes. Why are families so complicated? I laughed softly. That's a very big question. She thought about it. Is it because grown-ups forget to share? I looked at the small Christmas tree glowing in the corner of the room. Sometimes, I said, sometimes people just forget what fairness looks like. She nodded slowly, as if that explanation made perfect sense. Then she leaned against my shoulder, and in that quiet moment I realized something important. The most powerful part of the story wasn't the money. It wasn't the argument. It wasn't even the trust. It was the choice. The choice to stand up quietly when something wasn't fair. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with dramatic speeches or loud confrontations. Sometimes it arrives with a calm decision. And the courage to follow through. If you've ever faced a moment where you had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for what was right, you already know how difficult that choice can be. So I'm curious. What would you have done in Jennifer's place? Would you have approved the investment immediately, or reviewed it the way she did? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this about family, hidden power, and unexpected justice resonate with you, make sure you stay with the channel. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us for the next story. Because sometimes the quietest decisions end up changing everything. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.